Moloch, the ancient demon they tried to erase from history. His name is carved not in stone inscriptions, not in long genealogies, but in the silence of Scripture. He is introduced not with myths, not with worshippers, but with a command. Erase him, forget him, fear him. And yet, the attempt to bury him failed. For Moloch is not merely a name. He is hunger. He is smoke. He is the echo of drums that never stopped. The observer lingers on that name, Moloch. Heavy as ash in the mouth, acrid as smoke clinging to skin. Unlike Zeus, Osiris, or Baal, he carries no story, no clear mythology. Instead, he arrives in fragments, in prohibitions that sound more like alarms. In Leviticus, the words are blunt. Do not give your children to Moloch. No background, no description. Just a law like a stone slammed into the earth. And perhaps that is why the name endures. Most gods of the ancient world come with ornament, temples, myths, legends of power. But Moloch appears only in the form of warning, as if his essence is too terrible to be described, or as if no words could contain it. He is a void into which each generation has poured its deepest fears. For some, he was a Canaanite deity of fire and bronze. For others, he was never a god at all, but a twisted ritual misremembered as a name. For theologians, he became a demon, a servant of hell itself. And for poets, he was something even worse, an idea, a system, an appetite that outlives its worshippers. The observer imagines ancient Jerusalem. Just outside the city walls lies a valley, the Valley of Hinnom, where smoke rises day and night. Mothers clutch their children as they pass by, never daring to look directly at the fires within. The drums thunder, drowning out the cries that no one wishes to hear. No prophet needs to explain it. The people know. The name Moloch is enough. This is why history could not erase him. The less said, the more imagined. The fewer details given, the more shapes he could take. Bronze colossus, bull-headed idol, demon general, symbol of industry, metaphor for systems that demand endless sacrifice. Moloch has worn them all. He evolves because he was never confined to one form. What matters is not who he was, but what he consumes. The story begins not with his worshippers, not even with his idols, but with the silence around him. A silence thick with smoke, where the absence of explanation becomes its own kind of terror. The observer speaks his name again. Moloch, the ancient demon they tried to erase. And already the fire trembles back to life. The first thing the text gives is not a story, but a line in stone. You shall not give any of your children to Moloch. The words arrive like a hammer blow, without preface, as if the scribe carved them while the chisel was still hot. There is no origin tale to frame it, no genealogy to soften the edge. Only a prohibition, a wall raised in a single sentence. The observer notices how such a line changes the air around it. It is not explanation, it is alarm. It does not ask for understanding, it demands refusal. In the law code that follows, the tone hardens further. Anyone who performs this act is to be cut off. The community must not look away. If the people refuse to see, the text adds a final severity. The divine face will turn against them. In the rhythm of the passage, each phrase strikes like a drumbeat. Do not give. Do not profane. Do not look away. The cadence is martial, the vocabulary spare. Even before there is a tale to tell, there is a boundary to defend. The observer lingers on the grammar. The command does not say, do not worship Moloch. It says specifically, do not give your children. The center of gravity is not the altar or the idol, but the child, the custodian of tomorrow. Whatever Moloch is, The text sets him in opposition to future itself. The ban is not only religious, it is generational. It protects the next breath, the next harvest of names. The law reads less like theology than like a rescue rope thrown across time. A mainstream fact sits clearly on the surface. Later passages locate the horror just outside the city, in a valley south and west of the walls where fires smoldered and the memory of drums refuses to fade. That valley would carry a second name, one that would echo as metaphor for judgment in later eras. But in the moment of the warning, the text is content to be specific and terse. The city is here. The valley is there. The line between them is not to be crossed. Yet the words also conceal complexities that scholars still debate. Some argue that the term behind Moloch might once have been a title, perhaps king, or even a technical label for a type of offering. In this reading, the text outlaws a ritual more than a personified being. Others insist the name points to a distinct deity honored by neighboring cultures, a figure whose rites crept toward Jerusalem like smoke curling under a door. The scriptural Hebrew, consonants ancient, vowels added by later hands, keeps the question open like a wound that never fully closes. What exactly is being named here? A god, a rite, or a danger too fluid to pin down? The observer hears another drum in the verses, the responsibility of the community. The warning does not envision solitary guilt sealed behind private doors. It imagines a public sin that requires a public refusal. If the city averts its gaze, the text says, even the blindfold will be judged. The prohibition is not only personal morality, but civic maintenance. The law becomes a kind of fire break, a strip of earth kept bare so the flames cannot leap into the city's heart. There is, too, a mystical undertow to the brevity. The ancient world knew the power of names. Sometimes to speak a thing was to feed it. The refusal to narrate Moloch in detail may itself be a strategy, an apotropaic silence, a starved vocabulary meant to deny the thing's shape. Rather than recounting stories that might, by repetition, become a kind of dark liturgy, the text draws a circle and writes one sentence upon it, "You shall not." The observer senses that this is language used not to illuminate, but to barricade. Between the beats of law and the hush of taboo, a human scene takes shape. A father, a mother, a small hand folded inside a larger one. The city's gate yawns open. The road to the valley descends like a thought one should not think. In the scripture's economy of detail, nothing is said about their faces, their reasons, their pressure. The silence invites speculation. Famine, fear, a vow made in panic, a community swept by a fashion of terror disguised as devotion. The law knows that motives multiply. It does not catalog them. It stops the procession at the threshold. The observer recalls a line from a prophet who saw too much. The act, he said, was something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. The phrase is startling. It suggests not merely prohibition, but dissonance, an offense against imagination itself. As if this ritual does not simply break a rule, it violates the grammar of creation. Parental love, the text assumes, is aligned with the world's intended music. To ask for its inversion is to demand a song that cannot be sung without tearing the instrument. And yet, the debate persists, drifting like smoke over the centuries. Were the ancient warnings responding to a real and regular practice at specific shrines? Or to a specter invoked to sharpen boundaries against surrounding peoples? Excavations in distant colonies of related cultures have offered urns and ashes that some read as evidence and others question as misread burials or politicized narratives. Scholars still wonder if the phrase, "to pass through the fire," describes a symbolic trial or a literal offering. The archive refuses finality. The ash is real. Its story is contested. The observer returns to the text itself, to the way it binds theology to tenderness. The law does not aim at the lofty abstractions that gods often command. It speaks to the kitchen table, the cradle, the whispered promise made at a birth. In its austere way, it defends lullabies. The prohibition is a liturgy of protection, a covenant written in the simple future tense. They shall live. The city's safety is measured not by walls, but by how it guards the smallest breath within them. If Moloch is, as some later voices suggest, less a person than a principle, the warning reads like a diagnosis. It isolates a pathogen, the logic that calls destruction necessary, that rebrands love as negotiable, that baptizes fear as prudence. The law refuses that calculus at the root. It does not weigh outcomes or barter exceptions. It speaks before the ledger opens. In doing so, it suggests that the true contest is not between priests at rival altars, but between two imaginations of the world. One that builds forward by keeping the future safe, and one that devours it to quiet today's panic. And still the drums of the verses continue. Do not give, do not profane, do not look away. The observer hears in them both history and warning. The city is always a few steps from the valley. The gate is always open. What Scripture gives here is not a story to be admired, but a guard post to be manned. A line to be held when smoke rolls low and fear begins to bargain. So the narrative that refuses to start with myth begins instead with a boundary. The first portrait of Moloch is a negative. What must not happen? Who must not be taken? The law carves out a clearing in which the rest of the tale can be told. Beyond that clearing, the fire waits and the drums remember. Within it, the observer marks the ground, with the only sentence strong enough to be an opening. You shall not give. The silence of Scripture was never complete. Into that silence, voices rose. Prophets with fire in their throats, kings with reforms carved into action. Again and again, the name of Moloch appeared, not to tell his story but to record the attempts to erase it. The observer sees how condemnation itself became a kind of chronicle. The prophets would not describe him, but they would not let him stand unchallenged either. The book of Jeremiah speaks most directly, setting the scene in the Valley of Hinnom, also called Tophet. There the people, he laments, burned their sons and their daughters in the fire. Something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. The words quiver with disbelief. Jeremiah is not merely outraged, he is bewildered. The act is so alien to the divine imagination that it reads like an intrusion into reality itself. The prophet records not just sin, but dissonance, a rupture between what should be and what is. Elsewhere, the kings of Judah confront the same specter. In the second book of Kings, we are told of Josiah, the reformer king. In his 12th year, he turns his gaze toward Tophet, toward the high places of sacrifice, and he desecrates them. The ashes are scattered, the altars pulled down, bones burned upon bones so that the ground itself might recoil. This was more than religious reform. It was an exorcism. By undoing the sanctity of the site, Josiah sought to unmake Moloch's grip on the people's imagination. His reign is remembered as righteous precisely because he drew a blade across this ritual, severing it from the land. The observer imagines the smoke of those purges mingling with the smoke of older fires. Bones crackling, drums silent now, their rhythm replaced by the clang of destruction. The high places crumble, yet the name remains. Moloch is fought not by definition, but by demolition. He is opposed not with theology, but with hammers. The very absence of myth around him forces a different kind of warfare, one where silence must be met with obliteration. Mainstream history agrees. Josiah's campaign was a watershed moment, an attempt to centralize worship in Jerusalem and to cleanse the kingdom of competing cults. In this, Moloch was more than an enemy god. He was a symbol of resistance to reform, a lingering stain from neighboring traditions. But scholars still argue over how literal the accounts should be read. Was child sacrifice widespread, or was it magnified as a polemic? Were the fires at Tophet fed regularly with human life? Or was the language sharpened by prophetic outrage? Archaeology offers hints, ashes, bones, urns, but no final verdict. The ambiguity does not diminish the weight of the warnings. On the contrary, it heightens them. The prophets did not list the details of ritual, did not explain the shape of the idol or the cadence of the prayers. Instead, they sharpened memory into one horror: children through fire. That phrase becomes Moloch's definition, the axis around which every denunciation spins. If Baal was a storm, if Asherah was fertility, Moloch was sacrifice stripped of love, devotion without mercy. The prophets found no other words necessary. The observer listens for the tone beneath these denunciations. It is not the casual dismissal of foreign gods as lesser powers. It is the shrill urgency of survival. The prophets sound as if they are describing a contagion. Moloch is not merely a rival. He is a disease that can spread through culture if left unchecked. The cure is radical. Destruction of altars, desecration of sites, the cutting off of anyone who participates. The violence of the response mirrors the violence of the practice. Both revolve around fire. One consumes children, the other consumes memory. And yet, the tension remains. The very act of condemning Moloch keeps him alive. Every denunciation becomes another line of testimony. Every prophet who curses him etches the name deeper into the page. The kings may destroy his shrines, but in the act of destroying, they acknowledge the power that required such measures. The observer notes the paradox. The harder they try to erase him, the sharper his silhouette becomes. This is perhaps why Moloch's presence feels less like mythology and more like haunting. He is not remembered for stories, but for the efforts to silence him. The kings and prophets did not allow him to fade quietly. They dragged him into judgment, tied his name to fire, and left it to smolder across centuries. In doing so, they ensured that even in absence, he would be remembered as the god, or demon, who demanded too much. The observer looks again at Josiah, the king who defiled Tophet. His reforms were sweeping, his zeal unmatched, and yet within a generation, the fires would burn again in memory, if not in practice. Moloch proves difficult to bury because he was never merely a ritual. He was a symbol, an archetype, a shapeshifter whose power lay not in temples of stone, but in the human willingness to sacrifice what should never be sacrificed. Kings can tear down shrines, but they cannot always tear down fear. Prophets can cry out against the valley, but the drums can still echo in imagination. So the story moves forward. The prophets resist, the kings purge, but the silence remains pregnant with dread. The question grows louder with every attempt to erase it. Who or what was Moloch really? The observer pauses at the threshold of Scripture's silence. What strikes more than the prohibitions or the condemnations is the refusal to explain. The texts name Moloch, forbid his worship, describe the horror of burning children, and then fall quiet. No origin, no myth, no genealogy. It is as though the scribe slammed a door and left it locked. And that silence, paradoxically, may be the most powerful element of the story. Why so little detail? Scholars have suggested many answers. One line of thought is practical. To describe a ritual is to risk tempting imitation. Better to give no blueprint at all. Another possibility is cultural. Perhaps the worship of Moloch was so notorious, so widely understood in the ancient Near East, that no elaboration was necessary. Everyone knew what it meant. To spell it out would be redundant. And then there is the more mystical explanation. The silence itself is an act of protection, an exorcism by omission. To name too much would give the figure substance. To narrate would be to animate. The observer senses this third possibility lingering like smoke. Ancient cultures often treated names as power. To speak the true name of a god or demon was to summon them. The scriptures may withhold details for the same reason they gave prohibitions and clipped commands. Every word risks becoming fuel. The fewer the words, the less there is to ignite. In this sense, the silence is not ignorance, but strategy. Still, that silence has consequences. It invites imagination to fill the void. Later interpreters could not resist sketching shapes into the smoke. If the Bible would not describe Moloch, others would. Medieval artists drew him with a bull's head and outstretched arms. Early Christian theologians placed him in the hierarchy of hell. Poets turned him into machinery, into war, into the cold logic of sacrifice. The silence became a canvas, and the human mind painted fear upon it. Mainstream history notices the same pattern. Moloch is almost unique among ancient gods for being defined more by condemnation than by cult. We have no hymns, no temple inventories, no myths that celebrate him. We have only prohibitions, curses, and the lingering image of fire. Even the archaeological record resists clarity. The urns of Carthage may be evidence, or they may be misunderstood. The biblical word itself may mean king or offering. The figure remains more absence than presence, more question than answer. Yet that very lack becomes fuel for the imagination. The observer hears the echo of a paradox. The less we know, the more terrifying he becomes. A god with clear rituals can be dismissed as a relic of his culture. But a figure wrapped in silence, with only hints of horror, becomes timeless. He cannot be pinned down, so he adapts. He becomes the face of whatever a culture most fears: foreign cults, demonic corruption, industrial machinery, secret societies. The silence left room for Moloch to evolve endlessly. The observer reflects on the psychological weight of such omission. Fear often grows in the spaces where words fail. A child told not to go into the forest imagines worse monsters than any hunter could describe. Likewise, a culture told, "Do not give your children to Moloch," without further explanation, imagines terrors that grow with each generation. The silence does not erase him, it magnifies him. And so, the deliberate silence of Scripture becomes its own kind of revelation. Moloch is not described because he does not need to be. The act itself, the burning of children, defines him more than any myth could. In the logic of the text, that is enough. He is not a storm god, not a fertility idol, not a warrior deity. He is sacrifice without love, obedience without mercy. His story is the absence of story, his presence the void where narrative should be. The observer lets the silence stretch. It tastes like smoke. It feels like a room sealed against light. And within that hush, one question pulses like a heartbeat. Was Moloch a god, a ritual, or something far worse? An eternal hunger that wears many names. but is never satisfied. The silence does not answer. Perhaps it never was meant to. The silence of Scripture left only fragments. But the earth itself sometimes speaks where words do not. Centuries after the prophets cried out against Moloch, archaeologists dug into the soil of Carthage and Phoenician colonies across the Mediterranean. What they found was not myth, not rumor, but ash. Hundreds upon hundreds of urns, each holding the charred remains of infants and small animals. Some scholars called these grounds Tophets, echoing the valley outside Jerusalem. In these layers of earth, the observer sees history whispering its testimony, not in sentences, but in soot. Mainstream archaeology records the discovery with unease. In Carthage, the burial grounds extend in terraces, each urn carefully placed, marked by stelae etched with symbols of divinity, crescent moon stars, and stylized figures raising their hands in blessing. The soil is blackened, the bones brittle. For some, the evidence is clear. These were offerings, sacrifices made to secure rain in drought or victory in war. For others, the interpretation is less certain. Perhaps these were cemeteries for children who died young, their remains honored in fire before burial. The debate persists, with evidence pointing both ways, leaving certainty elusive. The observer notes how the ambiguity itself mirrors Moloch's nature. Was he a god of flame, or a name for a ritual? Were these ashes proof of ritual slaughter, or of mourning sanctified by fire? Archaeologists, like prophets before them, cannot agree. Some point to inscriptions dedicating offerings to Baal Hammon or Tanit, suggesting that what Scripture condemned as to Moloch might have been worship of these Phoenician deities. Others emphasize the sheer scale of the remains, arguing that accidental mortality alone cannot explain it. Too many urns, too many layers of fire. The ground seems to breathe with a rhythm of sacrifice. And yet, even here, certainty slips away. Ash is not an easy storyteller. It conceals as much as it reveals. Some bones bear the marks of fire. But was it the fire of sacrifice or the fire of cremation in grief? Some urns hold both infants and animals together, a mingling that could be symbolic ritual or a sign of ordinary funerary practice. Scholars still quarrel across conference halls, their voices echoing with the same uncertainty that Scripture left. The observer imagines the scene not as data, but as life. A mother standing before the furnace, whether in sorrow or in ritual, holding the weight of an infant in her arms. Priests chanting, drums perhaps sounding as they once did in Jerusalem's valley. Or perhaps it was quieter, more intimate. A family placing ashes into the earth with prayer. In either vision, the fire consumes the boundary between devotion and devastation. What was meant as honor becomes indistinguishable from horror. The mainstream fact is simple. The Carthaginian Tophets exist, vast and undeniable. The fringe interpretation whispers something darker. That these sites are proof of a long tradition of child sacrifice reaching across cultures. From the valleys of Canaan to the shores of the Mediterranean. In this reading, Moloch was never a localized deity, but a hunger carried in ships, traveling with colonists, infecting city after city. An ancient cult not erased, but spread, its embers glowing in distant lands. But the scholarly uncertainty remains. Some insist the accusations of child sacrifice were propaganda. Rome, after all, had every reason to demonize Carthage, its rival across the sea. To accuse an enemy of burning their children is to brand them with the ultimate stain, justifying conquest as moral necessity. Could it be That Moloch's legend was sharpened on the whetstone of political rivalry? That what the prophets condemned was transformed into Rome's slander, until the ashes of Carthage carried more weight as symbol than as fact? The observer watches how the debate itself keeps the fire alive. Whether literal ritual or exaggerated polemic, the image of children passed into flame persists. The soil of Carthage may hold truth, or it may hold a mirror polished by fear and propaganda. Either way, the name of Moloch is carried forward, his hunger remembered in layers of ash. The silence of Scripture demanded imagination. The ashes of Carthage demand reckoning. To hold the urn in one's hands is to feel the fragility of bone turned to dust. To stand among the stelae is to hear the faint hum of drums that no longer beat. And in that silence, the observer whispers the question again. Were these children victims of ritual, or mourned in fire as part of grief? The earth gives no final answer. It only exhales smoke. The observer sees how imagination rushes to fill silence with form. Where Scripture withheld detail, later centuries sculpted it in fire and metal. Thus, Moloch was given a body, not the flesh of men, not the softness of idols carved in wood or stone, but the permanence of bronze and the terror of iron. Across medieval manuscripts, paintings, and whispered traditions, he emerges towering, colossal, his head that of a bull, his chest hollow as a furnace, his arms outstretched like a cruel invitation. This image, part God, part machine, has endured for centuries. In one vision, he is seated like a king, posture rigid, legs wide, daring mortals to approach. In another, he looms upright, mouth gaping as though frozen mid-roar. Always his belly burns with fire. Priests, it was said, would stoke the flames within, until the statue glowed red-hot, metal shimmering like an open wound. The sacrifice was not laid upon an altar, but into the arms of the idol itself. The child handed to bronze that seared without mercy. The observer lingers on the paradox of such a form. Most deities of the ancient world embodied beauty or awe. Apollo radiant with light, Isis crowned with stars, Vishnu serene on the cosmic sea. But Moloch's imagined form is grotesque, industrial, terrifying. He does not seduce, he intimidates. He is less like a god and more like a device, a machine for transforming devotion into ash. Some scholars suggest this vision of the bronze colossus was itself symbolic, a later invention to dramatize what the prophets condemned. Yet, whether literal or metaphor, the imagery persists because it captures something essential: the fusion of worship and machinery. Sacrifice turned into process. Mainstream history reminds us that no such bronze statue has ever been unearthed. There is no archaeological proof of a bull-headed furnace idol. The colossus lives in imagination, not in soil. And yet, the consistency of its appearance across cultures and centuries suggests a deeper truth. Sometimes myth is not about evidence, but about resonance. The image survives because it embodies what people feared Moloch to be: a god who devours without compassion, an idol that feeds on life itself. The observer imagines standing before such a statue. The heat radiates, the arms glow red, the mouth open in silence. Around it, drums thunder to mask what cannot be unheard. To approach it is not to feel awe, but dread. Not reverence, but surrender. One does not bring offerings here by choice. One brings them because necessity has been twisted into command. The very posture of the idol, arms open, mimics protection, but delivers destruction. A parody of parenthood, a mockery of embrace. Fringe traditions expand the imagery further. Some medieval demonologies described Moloch not only as a bull-headed idol, but as a crowned king among demons, ruling legions with fire. Others imagined his belly as a gateway, a furnace whose flames did not only consume bodies, but released something darker, feeding a hunger that stretched beyond ritual. In these visions, the Colossus is more than metal. It is a mask for a force that no hammer can break. Scholars still debate whether this image was invented as propaganda, an exaggeration meant to frighten believers away from rival cults, or whether it reflects some memory of actual ritual devices. The line between symbol and fact remains blurred. Was there truly a bronze idol in the Valley of Hinnom, arms glowing, drums echoing? Or did imagination conjure it because the silence of Scripture begged for shape? The answer remains hidden, like embers beneath ash. The observer notes that either way, the image works as myth. For centuries, poets and preachers have pointed to the bronze colossus as the embodiment of evil that is both human and more than human. It is not merely a monster. It is a system cast in metal, a machine that takes what is most sacred and renders it fuel. That is why the image endures. Whether or not such a statue ever stood, the Colossus stands still, in memory, in metaphor, in the fear that somewhere, something is always waiting with outstretched arms and a fire inside. And so the figure of Moloch solidifies. Not a vague shadow, not only a name in a law, but an idol of iron and fire, an archetype of cruelty disguised as ritual. The observer lets the vision fade, leaving only the outline: a bull's head, bronze arms, a furnace belly. Smoke curls upward. The drums begin again. The observer studies the bronze colossus until its heat becomes an argument. The flames explain themselves. They do not ask. They require. That is Moloch's true invention, not the idol, but the logic. It is the grammar by which love becomes a currency. You do not approach because beauty calls. You approach because fear has renamed necessity. Somewhere, a bargain has been drafted. Give what you cannot bear to lose, and in return, you will be spared what you cannot bear to face. Famine, defeat, disgrace. Each is given a price. The drums supply the math. In this arithmetic, devotion is no longer a song, it is a transaction. The arms of the idol imitate and embrace, and in that imitation, a terrible syllogism appears. If the future is threatened, then the future must be paid. The observer hears how phrases harden into policy. Only this once, for the greater good, so that others may live. The language presents itself as courage, but underneath it pulses an old fear. What if survival demands betrayal? When that question is allowed to stand, the altar is already built. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. Across multiple passages, the phrase "to pass through the fire" recurs, attached to the same warning. The repetition suggests not a stray metaphor, but a recognized pattern, a ritual familiar enough that a simple formula could name it. The texts do not explain its choreography, because the choreography had already entered common speech. Even now, the observer notes, the expression survives as shorthand for trials that purport to purify, even when they only consume. This is the cunning at the center of Moloch's argument. He reframes harm as duty. He does not promise pleasure, he promises order. He offers not luxury, but certainty. In harsh seasons, that certainty becomes seductive. A city under siege looks for a lever to pull, a knob to turn. If a cost will stabilize the world, who dares refuse the cashier? The mechanism becomes self-protecting. To question the sacrifice is to appear disloyal to the city's survival. Thus does the ritual hide inside patriotism, piety, prudence. Fringe tradition names the power behind that mechanism. Demonologies speak of a principality that feeds not on desire, but on capitulation, a force that accelerates whenever people trade tenderness for control. In such accounts, Moloch rules the dominion where law is weaponized against love, where the family bond is treated as negotiable, where fear drafts all virtues into its service. He is not a tempter in alleys. He is an engineer in the square. His inventions are committees, procedures, drums. Scholarly uncertainty still hovers over the terms. Philologists note that MLK might once have been a title, Melech, king, or even a class of offerings rather than a proper name. If so, the texts could be condemning a category of vow rather than a deity. Others counter that later traditions clearly personified the horror, mapping it onto a figure worshipped among neighbors. The debate refuses to close. Was the logic born from a name, or did the name emerge to contain a logic already stalking the world? The observer returns to the household where the logic does its deepest carving. A parent holds a future in their arms. Fear arrives with a ledger. Pledge the future to protect the present. The pitch sounds pious because it invokes responsibility. But responsibility, pulled out of love and pressed into calculation, collapses into something smaller: accounting. In that collapse, the parent becomes a functionary of their own dread. This is Moloch's true ritual, not the moment at the furnace, but the long apprenticeship in which people learn to pronounce tenderness as liability. Consider how easily the machinery scales. A city decides its children may work before their bones have hardened, for the economy. A generation is told that silence buys peace, for stability. A school narrows wonder into metrics, for outcomes. None of these scenes is as vivid as drums and fire, but each borrows the same grammar. The offering is rationalized, the cost is abstracted, the beneficiaries are unnamed. As the observer listens, the cadence is familiar. Only this once, only these, only until the crisis passes. Mainstream history marks how reformers fought such cadences with counter-rituals, laws, festivals, public lamentations that reasserted the value of the small and the next. The observance of rest, the redemption of firstborns, the liturgies that wrap infancy in blessing. Each is a disciplined contradiction of Moloch's math. They teach a different calculus, whereby the future is not a chip to be wagered, but a trust to be guarded. The observer recognizes these practices as fire breaks, strips of damp earth laid down across a tinder-dry hillside. But uncertainty persists even among defenders. Were the ancient condemnations aimed at an actual engine of sacrifice, thrumming in specific shrines, or at a contagious idea that could inhabit any shrine, any policy, any household? Archaeologists sift ash. Historians weigh rhetoric. Theologians map hierarchies. None can fully disentangle the device from the desire that built it. Perhaps that is the point. A machine can be dismantled. A logic must be unlearned. The observer hears a softer drum then, the heartbeat of resistance. It keeps a different time. Instead of "for the greater good," it murmurs "for the greater mercy." Instead of "only this once," it insists "not this." The counter-logic does not deny danger or hunger or siege. It simply refuses to purchase safety with a coin that would bankrupt the soul. It treats children, promises, and the powerless not as inputs, but as ends. This refusal may look irrational in a crisis, but it is in fact the only arithmetic that allows a future to be more than an extension of fear. Even so, Moloch's logic evolves. If an idol cannot command the square, an institution might. If an institution cannot, a narrative will. The observer watches how stories are forged to sanctify the trade. Sagas about necessary losses, romances of heroic denial, parables in which the hard choice is always the holy one. The shape-shifting continues, but the demand is unchanged. Fire is patient. It accepts new fuel. And here the section returns to the bronze arms, glowing with a light that impersonates sanctity. The imitation is the warning. Embrace without warmth, order without love, duty without joy. Each is a counterfeit that teaches the hands to open at the wrong moment. The observer steps back from the heat and sees, in the shimmer, the outline of a larger truth. Moloch's power is not in being worshipped. It is in being obeyed by people who would swear they do not believe in him at all. What breaks the spell is not a grand argument, but a practiced tenderness. Small refusals, local mercies, liturgies that keep names from becoming numbers. That work is slow, almost scandalously ordinary. It will never sound as dramatic as drums, but it is the arithmetic by which the future stops being collateral. Beyond the colossus, beyond the valley, beyond the arguments of scholars and the murmurs of grimoires, the observer hears that quieter counting. It is the only mathematics in which love is not a subtracted term. The flames dim slightly, as if the logic, seen clearly, has lost some of its authority. Smoke folds back into sky. The next question gathers like a hush at the edge of the clearing. If Moloch is a logic, what then is he metaphysically? A system can grind, a story can spread, but is there a presence behind them? Or only our fear finding gears? The observer turns toward that question, where form dissolves into concept, and the hunger is named without a face. The observer turns from the bronze colossus and stares into the space behind it. The void from which the idol may have risen. The fire is still there, but without a body to contain it. The flames drift like thought. If Moloch is not merely a god of bronze, not only an idol of bull and furnace, then what is left? Perhaps he is a hunger, a logic given voice, a principle that wears idols the way smoke wears chimneys. In this view, Moloch was never truly erased because there was nothing to erase. A statue can be toppled, a shrine desecrated, a name forbidden, but hunger does not crumble. It only changes its costume. Some theologians of the intertestamental period intuited this. When they spoke of false gods, they did not mean inert statues, but intelligences, malignancies with will. Early Christians sharpened the claim further, naming these forces demons, each a shadow intelligence whispering behind ritual. In this genealogy, Moloch is not an idol to be smashed, but a principality to be resisted, a spirit whose dominion is sacrifice without mercy. Mainstream scholarship resists such personifications. Philologists remind us that Moloch may have been only a technical term, that demonology was a later development, that archaeology offers ambiguous evidence at best. They emphasize cultural context. Israel's prophets may have exaggerated the crimes of their neighbors to sharpen the line of distinction, portraying foreign rites as monstrous. Yet even these cautious voices admit something remarkable. Moloch, whether deity or term, is always associated with the same theme: consuming the future in fire. That consistency itself suggests a deeper pattern. The observer listens to how this hunger speaks. It does not seduce like other demons in lore. It does not promise pleasure or power. It only whispers necessity. It tells rulers that survival demands sacrifice. It tells parents that fear demands surrender. It tells nations that prosperity demands lives. Its voice is bureaucratic, efficient, without passion. and perhaps that is why it terrifies more deeply than any siren's call. It is the cold voice of inevitability. Fringe traditions, especially in mystical writings, describe Moloch less as a figure and more as an atmosphere. He is not encountered in visions of claw or horn, but in systems that feel too large to fight. He is the smoke that blinds, the drumbeat that drowns protest, the reasoning that makes atrocity seem logical. In such accounts, Moloch is not outside humanity, but inside our institutions, our narratives, even our desires. He is hunger woven into order. The observer imagines him not in temples, but in parliaments, markets, and courts. His arms are no longer bronze, they are contracts. His furnace is no longer hollow metal, it is policy, industry, war. The children who pass through the fire are not always literal. They may be generations mortgaged to debt, dreams crushed under systems, innocence bartered for convenience. In this metaphysical dimension, Moloch becomes not only a memory of ancient horror, but a mirror held up to every age. And yet, uncertainty clings like smoke. Was this truly the intent of the original texts? Did the prophets mean to warn against a demon, or only against a neighbor's ritual? Scholars still quarrel. Some argue the demonological Moloch was a Christian invention, a way of framing rival deities as satanic. Others insist the hunger was always there, implicit in the horror of the fire, even if unspoken. What the texts do not say may be the loudest part of their message. The observer tastes the air and finds it thick with ambiguity. Perhaps this is the most accurate portrait of Moloch. Not a clear figure, but a haze, a hunger that resists form. He is always at the margins, half-named, half-erased, yet perpetually returning. When the prophets describe him, they speak in commands, not in narratives. When the poets evoke him, they give him faces, crowns, thrones. But none of these depictions lasts. They all burn away, leaving only the hunger beneath. And so, Moloch is remembered less as a deity than as a principle that corrupts devotion itself. He does not ask for love, only for transaction. He does not inspire myth, only warnings. The observer notes how rare this is in the ancient world. Most gods gave, Moloch only took. Most demanded ritual in exchange for blessing. Moloch demanded the blessing itself as ritual. His power is parasitic, living off the inversion of what should be sacred. That inversion is his essence, his metaphysical core. The hunger beyond form is difficult to confront because it is difficult to see. It hides in law, in necessity, in the voice that says, "This is how the world works." But the observer insists that naming it, even as absence, even as ambiguity, is itself resistance. To call the hunger Moloch is to refuse its anonymity. It is to remind ourselves that this calculus is not natural, not inevitable, but chosen, perpetuated, and therefore dwarfed breakable. Smoke curls, drums echo faintly, and the silhouette dissolves. Moloch without form is harder to fight, but also harder to forget. The observer steps closer to the valley where this hunger once had a name and finds that the fire has not gone out. It has simply moved. The observer turns his gaze toward the valley itself. South of Jerusalem's walls lies a place that the prophets called Tophet, in the Valley of Hinnom. To later ages, it would bear another name, Gehenna, the word that came to signify hell itself. But before it became a symbol, it was a location, a site of ritual remembered with dread. Here, the texts say, the fire never ceased. Here, drums thundered without pause, not to celebrate but to smother the cries of children. The observer imagines the scene as scripture leaves it. Smoke curling upward in constant columns, carrying the scent of ash into the city above. To walk near the valley is to smell burning long before one sees the flames. The ground is scorched, the stones blackened. The people know what happens there, even if they do not speak of it. Silence is their only defense, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the drums. Tophet itself may take its name from Toph, the Hebrew word for drum. The ritual hides its horror behind noise. Mainstream history acknowledges these references with caution. Jeremiah speaks directly of this valley, lamenting the children burned there as an abomination. The Book of Kings describes how King Josiah defiled the site, tearing down the high places and scattering bones to erase its sanctity. The biblical testimony is consistent. Tophet was synonymous with the horror of fire. Yet scholars still ask, how much of this was literal practice, and how much was rhetorical device? Some believe the valley was truly a cult center where sacrifice occurred. Others argue the stories exaggerate, using fire as a metaphor for apostasy. The ground beneath Hinnom has never yielded definitive evidence, leaving the debate unresolved. Fringe traditions push further, insisting that Tophet was not only real, but central, the furnace where Moloch demanded his due. Later writers described statues of bronze, arms outstretched, priests stoking flames inside the idol until the metal glowed. Infants were placed upon the searing hands, while drums beat louder and louder. Whether this vision was fact, propaganda, or invention, it became fixed in the collective imagination. Tophet as the place where love itself was burned. The observer sees the symbolism in every detail. The valley lies just outside the city gates, as if to remind the people that horror is never far away, always at the threshold. The drums drown out the cries, just as societies drown conscience in the noise of necessity. The fire never goes out, because once such a logic takes root, it renews itself endlessly. Tophet is not only a site, it is a cycle. The prophets turned the valley into a warning. Jeremiah proclaims that because of the abominations there, the place will no longer be called Tophet, but the Valley of Slaughter, where the enemy's dead will lie unburied. In this transformation, the valley shifts from ritual site to battlefield, from place of sacrifice to place of divine judgment. What was once humanity's cruelty becomes the setting of its own reckoning. The observer reflects on how this memory seeped forward into theology. When later Jewish and Christian writers spoke of hell, they borrowed the imagery of Gehenna, the same valley where fire burned and smoke ascended. The geography became eschatology. The drums of Tophet became the roar of damnation. Even if the precise history of the rituals remains contested, the valley's symbolic power is unquestioned. It became shorthand for everything intolerable, the very inversion of creation's intent. Mainstream scholars point out the striking psychological effect of this association. Unlike distant mythological underworlds, Hades or Sheol, Gehenna was a physical place one could walk to, visible from Jerusalem's walls. Its fires were not metaphorical. They smoldered before the people's eyes. To map hell onto this valley was to root cosmic judgment in local geography. Every time smoke rose from its floor, memory revived the warning. The observer lets imagination sharpen what scholarship cannot confirm. He hears the relentless beating of the drums, their rhythm faster than heartbeats, covering screams with a wall of sound. He sees the fire glowing in the hollow belly of bronze, sparks leaping into the night. Parents stand rigid, persuaded or coerced into betraying their own blood. The priests raise their hands, the crowd chants, and the future itself is consumed The air is hot, thick, unbearable. The valley becomes not only a place of ritual, but an image of a world where love is reversed, where creation devours itself. And in this image, the observer senses why silence surrounds Moloch's name. Some horrors do not require elaboration. The sound of drums, the sight of fire, the smell of ash, these alone are enough to sear memory. To describe more would be redundant. To say less is to let fear fill in the rest. The Valley of Drums lingers as both fact and metaphor. Fact, in that texts and perhaps even archaeology point toward real fire, real ash. Metaphor, in that the valley has become a stand-in for any system where innocence is traded for stability, where the cries of the weak are drowned beneath the noise of the powerful. Whether ancient or modern, the rhythm remains. The observer listens closely. The drums have not stopped. They only change their skins. The observer watches the valley smolder and then notices how the story of Moloch changes as centuries pass. At first, he is only a foreign god, condemned by prophets, a name associated with fire and with the Valley of Tophet. But as Jewish thought stretched into the intertestamental period, and as Christianity emerged, the silence around Moloch was filled with something new: demonology. He was no longer simply an idol abandoned to history. He was recast as an intelligence, a will, a servant of darkness. In those shadowed centuries between the Old and New Testaments, spiritual imagination widened. Angels were given hierarchies, demons acquired names and ranks. The old gods of neighboring nations, once dismissed as false, were reinterpreted as active agents of corruption. The observer notes how this reframing was itself an act of defiance. Israel's enemies did not simply worship powerless idols. They bowed to hostile spirits. And among these spirits, Moloch found a new identity, not a regional deity, but a demon clothed in flame. Mainstream historians trace this development with care. They note how the Second Temple period produced texts like Enoch and Jubilees, works that populated the unseen realm with elaborate orders of angels and rebellious watchers. In such a world, there was little room for ambiguity. Every rival cult, every foreign practice, needed to be mapped onto a cosmic struggle. Moloch, associated with the most unthinkable sacrifice, could not remain a mere idol. He became the embodiment of what demons demand: worship twisted into cruelty. Early Christian theologians sharpened the picture. Church fathers such as Tertullian and Jerome no longer referred to Moloch as if he were a god at all. He was described instead as a demonic prince, a force aligned with Satan, one who fed not only on sacrifice, but on cultures themselves. To them, the fire of Tophet was not only historical memory, it was an image of hell, a foretaste of eternal judgment. Moloch was no longer outside the story of Christianity. He was inside it, a cautionary emblem of what happens when devotion is given to the wrong throne. The observer considers how this shift was both theological and psychological. To redefine Moloch as a demon was to ensure that he remained relevant. A forgotten idol is powerless. A demon, however, can still whisper. The valley may be silent, but the hunger can travel. In this way, Moloch crossed the centuries, carried not by worshippers, but by interpreters who found in him the perfect emblem of corruption. His power lay not in temples, but in imagination, in the fear that the same hunger might rise again under a different name. Fringe traditions amplified the image further. Medieval demonologists, compiling grimoires and catalogues of hell, assigned Moloch ranks among the princes of the infernal court. Some called him a general in Satan's army. His dominion always the same: sacrifice, fire, cruelty. Unlike other demons who seduce with temptation or deceit, Moloch was portrayed as blunt and brutal, demanding obedience, not persuasion. He was the cruel efficiency of evil, the administrator of horror. And yet uncertainty remains, as always. Was this truly Moloch's essence? Or was it an invention of later imaginations who needed to give shape to formless dread? Scholars debate whether demonology projected onto him qualities he never held in antiquity. Perhaps the prophets never intended him to be more than a symbol of forbidden practice. Perhaps the transformation into a demon was less discovery than reinterpretation, a way of carrying the warning forward into new eras. The observer sees the paradox. The attempt to erase Moloch by demonizing him only ensured his survival. In stripping him of divine status, they gave him something more enduring: mythic adaptability. As a god, he might have been confined to the pantheon of Canaan, a relic of one culture. As a demon, he could travel anywhere, step into any society, wear any mask. The redefinition kept him alive. This is how Moloch lingers: a figure half remembered, half reinvented, transformed by each generation into what it most fears. From idol to demon, from valley to hellfire, from local to universal, his shape shifts, but his hunger does not. The observer lets the vision settle. The drums fade, the bronze colossus darkens, but the idea of Moloch persists. An ancient presence reforged as a demon whose fire can burn in any age. The observer now steps into the candlelit chambers of the medieval imagination, where scribes bent over parchment tried to map the unseen world. In these centuries, the fascination with order, angelic ranks, demonic legions, celestial wheels, took hold of theology and folklore alike. If heaven could be arranged into choirs and dominions, then hell too must be charted. And in these infernal catalogs, Moloch found his place. Grimoires written in Latin and French, whispered from monastery to monastery, listed the names of demons with the precision of taxonomies. Beelzebub, prince of flies; Asmodeus, lord of lust; Belial, master of lies. Among them, Moloch was remembered not for cunning or seduction, but for something cruder: fire, blood, the machinery of sacrifice. He was described as a prince of hell, sometimes commanding whole armies, other times seated as a grim judge over flames. The constant thread was always the same. Moloch presided over cruelty disguised as duty, ritual made into atrocity. Mainstream scholars treat these hierarchies as cultural mirrors rather than cosmic maps. They point out how medieval Europe reimagined the old gods of rival faiths, folding them into the Christian demonological system. Moloch, once a name in the Hebrew scriptures, became in these texts a permanent citizen of hell. Yet the role assigned to him was telling. Unlike Lucifer, who dazzled with pride, or Mammon, who whispered with greed, Moloch did not lure. He demanded. His authority was not in persuasion, but in terror. The observer hears the difference. In the grimoires, Moloch is rarely depicted as roaming the world in disguise or seducing individuals with whispered bargains. Instead, he is the architect of systems. His dominion is not temptation, but structure. He governs the kind of evil that becomes ordinary, institutional, even celebrated. When armies march under banners declaring sacrifice for glory, when courts pass laws that normalize cruelty, when economies consume lives for profit, these are his rituals. In this sense, the demonology gave him a terrifying relevance. Moloch was not the demon of hidden sins. He was the demon of public policies. Fringe traditions embroidered the image further. Some alchemists and occultists described him as clothed in bronze armor, crowned with fire, his roars echoing like a furnace. Others imagined him enthroned, with an eternal blaze at his feet, demanding the souls of the young. His followers were said to beat drums and blow horns, echoing the old stories of Tophet. These depictions may not reflect any literal worship, but they reveal how deep the association between Moloch and mechanized cruelty had become. The observer reflects on the psychology behind this medieval taxonomy. By placing Moloch within hell's hierarchy, theologians accomplished two things. They condemned him eternally, but they also ensured he would never be forgotten. Once listed among the princes of darkness, he could not fade into obscurity. His name would echo whenever people recited the demonologies, whenever artists painted hellscapes, whenever poets described the torments of the damned. The effort to erase him had transformed him into a permanent fixture of memory. And yet, as always, uncertainty remains. Was Moloch truly worshipped in antiquity, as the texts claim? Or had his legend been inflated to fill a role in demonological imagination? Did the grimoires preserve truth about a spiritual power? Or did they merely project society's anxieties into the margins of hell? The debate continues, unresolved, feeding the sense that Moloch is less a person than a mirror for humanity's darkest fears. The observer imagines the medieval scribe, quills scratching against parchment, inscribing the name once more, Moloch. The letters are careful, deliberate, as though writing the word were itself a ritual. Outside the monastery, wars rage, plagues spread, children die young. Perhaps it was easier to believe that these sufferings belonged to a demon's dominion rather than to human failure. To name Moloch was to draw a circle around the horror, to contain it, even if only on the page. And so, in the infernal hierarchies, Moloch endures. He is not radiant like Lucifer, nor cunning like Belial, but blunt, brutal, a demon of systems and sacrifices. The observer closes the grimoire and sees again the Valley of Smoke, the bronze colossus, the drums. Each image folds into the other. Whether God, idol, or prince of hell, Moloch remains the figure who devours futures, who normalizes the unthinkable, who makes cruelty seem inevitable. The observer turns now to the 17th century, to a poet sitting in darkness, dictating lines of fire to his daughters. John Milton, blind but unbowed, composed Paradise Lost as a vast theater of rebellion, angels and demons clashing in the echo of creation. And among the fallen host, he placed a figure already infamous, Moloch. Here, in the poet's imagination, Moloch is no longer a shadow in scripture or a demon in grimoires. He is a warlord, blunt and unrelenting, a fiery general who urges open combat against heaven itself. Milton's Moloch stands apart from the subtler voices in Hell's council. Where Belial counsels delay and Mammon whispers of building a new kingdom underground, Moloch roars for immediate battle. He scorns subtlety, despises negotiation. His speech is a furnace of fury. Better to fall in flaming defeat than languish in servitude. In Milton's lines, the observer hears not the drums of Tophet, but the drumbeat of war, an unyielding cadence that calls for destruction as its own justification. Mainstream literary analysis notes how Milton assigned to Moloch the archetype of raw violence, stripped of strategy. If Satan himself embodies pride and cunning, Moloch embodies the opposite, brutal candor, destruction for destruction's sake. He is the demon of war without cause, the appetite for conflict that needs no reason beyond itself. In this way, Milton gave voice to something Scripture left unsaid: the personality of hunger. The observer finds in this portrayal an echo of the ancient warnings. For if the biblical Moloch demanded children in fire, Milton's Moloch demands armies in flame. The currency changes, but the logic remains. Lives offered to keep the machine of power grinding. The colossus of bronze is gone. In its place is the furnace of battle. Both consume the future in smoke. Fringe interpreters of Milton have seen more. Some argue that his depiction of Moloch reflects not only theology, but the political unrest of Milton's own age. England had endured civil war, regicide, and religious conflict. To imagine a demon who glorified unceasing violence was to give form to the chaos of the time. Moloch, in this reading, is not only a character in the poem, but an allegory for the destructive impulses of nations. The observer imagines Milton, blind eyes lifted, describing Moloch's fiery speech as though the words came not from his own mind, but from the smoke of history itself. The lines shudder with recognition. Here is the same hunger that once echoed in the Valley of Hinnom, the same demand that parents trade their children, now transposed onto battlefields where kings trade their soldiers. The idols change. The appetite does not. Scholars remain uncertain how much of Milton's portrayal drew from older demonologies versus his own invention. Did he inherit Moloch as a demon of war, or did he sculpt that role himself? The texts he read, patristic writings, medieval grimoires, were vague enough to allow interpretation. What is certain is that Milton's poem fixed this image into the Western imagination. After Paradise Lost, Moloch would never again be seen merely as a shadowy idol. He was now a warlord, a demon who embodied the destructive fire that nations kindle when reason fails. The observer listens to Milton's council scene. The demons argue, their voices varied, cunning, despairing, pragmatic. And then Moloch rises, blunt as iron, his speech hot with urgency. The silence that follows is heavy, for every listener knows the cost of following him. And yet, his words tempt, for they offer the illusion of control through fire, the same illusion that once lured parents to Tophet, the same illusion that smolders in every generation's wars. Thus, Moloch enters literature not only as a biblical remnant, but as an archetype of war's naked appetite. He is the demon who insists that peace is cowardice, that compromise is weakness, that destruction itself is victory. The observer steps back and sees how this literary mask is only another face for the same hunger, a hunger beyond idols, beyond demons, beyond history. The fire glows in Milton's lines. The general stands, armored in fury, crowned in smoke. And the observer realizes that though the poet sought to place him in the past, his shadow falls forward. Every time a drumbeat calls men to burn for causes they do not understand, Moloch's voice is heard again. The observer leaves Milton's 17th century vision and steps into the 20th, where another poet, restless and furious, wrote under the neon lights of America. Allen Ginsberg, in his 1955 poem Howl, summoned the name of Moloch again. Not as a bronze idol, not as a warlord of hell, but as a metaphor for modern machinery, the ravenous system of industrial society. Where Milton's Moloch roared for open battle, Ginsberg's Moloch was quieter, colder, a skyscraper of steel, a mind of pure machinery, a hunger that devoured dreams instead of bodies. The poem is raw, almost prophetic in its cadence. Ginsberg lists the losses of his generation: youth crushed by factories, by war machines, by economic systems that demanded everything and gave nothing back. And to give shape to that vast, consuming force, He names it Moloch. Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch, whose blood is running money. Moloch, whose fingers are 10 armies. In the relentless rhythm of those lines, the observer hears the same drumbeat as Tophet, but now muffled by typewriters and engines, by bureaucracies and bombs. Mainstream literary criticism sees in this invocation a radical transformation. Moloch becomes not just a demon of sacrifice, but the symbol of systemic dehumanization. No longer does he stand in valleys of fire. He towers in industrial skylines, his belly filled not with flames, but with gears. The ancient hunger, unnamed in scripture and dramatized in Milton, is here made modern. It is the logic of consumption, the economy that treats people as fuel. Ginsberg's Moloch does not need priests or idols. He thrives in paperwork, in smokestacks, in war budgets written in cold ink. The observer imagines the poet's voice, incantatory, chanting Moloch like a curse, like an alarm. Each repetition is both denunciation and acknowledgement. For Ginsberg, Moloch was not confined to history. He was alive in highways and offices, in the alienation of cities, in the grinding of souls against machinery. The poem turns the demon into a cultural diagnosis, a name for the sense that something vast and invisible is always demanding sacrifice, and that ordinary people deliver it without ever touching an altar. Fringe interpreters of Ginsberg have seen his Moloch as prophetic, as if he unwittingly resummoned an archetype that had waited in silence. They point to the way his description echoes ancient motifs: the hollow belly, the endless appetite, the generational cost. Whether consciously or not, Ginsberg tapped into the same current of dread that made prophets cry out and kings tear down altars. The difference is that his altar was not a furnace in a valley, but the industrial society itself. Scholarly uncertainty remains. Was Ginsberg merely borrowing a biblical name for shock value? Or did he intuit something deeper, that Moloch is less a figure than a pattern, a logic that survives by shifting forms? Whatever the answer, the poem ensured that the name once again entered common speech. In the 20th century, Moloch was no longer a forgotten idol or a dusty demon in grimoires. He became the face of the system, the symbol of everything that devours innocence in the name of progress. The observer reflects on how the motif of sacrifice persists across time. In Tophet, it was children through fire. In Milton, it was armies through war. In Ginsberg, it was human spirit through industry and bureaucracy. Each age has its altar, each altar has its fuel, and the name of Moloch lingers as the shorthand for the trade. The drums may be replaced by factory sirens, the smoke of fire by the smoke of chimneys, but the hunger is the same. And so, the story deepens. Moloch, once a name whispered in the margins of scripture, now echoes in modern poetry as a cultural curse. He has become not just an ancient demon, but a symbol that refuses to die, adapting to every form of power that demands sacrifice without love. The observer closes the book of Howl and feels the same old ash in the air. The fire may have changed shape, but it still burns. The observer steps out of poetry and into the uneasy terrain of rumor, where whispers cling to the edges of modern history. In this world, Moloch is no longer only a metaphor for industry or war, but a secret emblem for hidden powers. The most notorious of these whispers gathers around the Bohemian Grove in California, a secluded retreat where the powerful meet beneath redwoods. There, each summer, an effigy of a great owl is set aflame in ritual. Officially, it is called the cremation of care. a theatrical performance meant to symbolize the casting off of worldly burdens. Yet, in the shadows of speculation, another name is invoked: Moloch. The observer notes how conspiracy theorists seize on the imagery. A towering idol, fire-consuming an effigy, elites gathered in secrecy. These echoes are too sharp to ignore. Some claim the owl is merely a mask, a stand-in for the ancient demon of sacrifice. Others insist the rituals are not metaphorical at all, but a continuation of the old logic, hidden in plain sight. Whether true or false, the idea persists because it fits the pattern. Those in power, it is feared, still offer something precious to maintain their dominion. Mainstream journalism dismisses such claims as exaggeration, symbolic theater mistaken for sinister practice. The rituals, they argue, are pageantry and nothing more. But the observer notices how denial does little to erase suspicion. The human imagination, sharpened by centuries of silence around Moloch's name, is quick to leap when fire and idols appear together. Once an image has been branded into collective memory, every spark looks like the old flame reigniting. Fringe writers go further, tracing Moloch into the very architecture of modern institutions. They point to corporate towers, governmental seals, military ceremonies, arguing that the same hunger still circulates in systems of control. In their view, Moloch is not a literal statue, but an ideology that hides behind facades of progress. Where policies treat lives as expendable, where wars are waged for resources, where wealth is secured at the cost of generations, they say Moloch has been fed. The idol of bronze is gone, but the furnace has been rebuilt in abstract form. The observer reflects on why these conspiracies persist. They are not born only from paranoia, but from recognition. History itself has shown that societies repeatedly sacrifice the vulnerable for the security of the strong. Whether or not world leaders bow before an idol, the suspicion feels true because the pattern is real. Every culture that convinces itself cruelty is necessary walks again toward Tophet. The drums may be muted, but the rhythm is familiar. Scholarly voices remain cautious. They remind us that conspiracy thrives in uncertainty, that connecting ancient horrors to modern rituals risks distortion. Yet they too admit the resonance is powerful. Moloch has become a symbol that transcends fact. He is the language people use when they sense a hidden cost in systems they cannot fully see. He names the fear that someone, somewhere, is profiting from sacrifices unspoken. The observer envisions the scene at Bohemian Grove. Flames rising, effigy burning, chants echoing through the forest. To one viewer, it is only theater. To another, it is reenactment. To a third, it is evidence of an ancient hunger clothed in modern disguise. The ambiguity is the point. Like Scripture's silence, the lack of explanation becomes its own kind of fuel. People will fill the gap with their deepest fears. And once again, the name of Moloch flickers to life. Thus, in whispers and rumors, Moloch adapts yet again. He is no longer confined to valleys, grimoires, or poems. He lives in suspicion, in the idea that power always conceals a cost. Whether behind a mask of an owl or the glow of skyscrapers, the fear is the same. Somewhere, someone is still keeping the drums beating. The observer lets the centuries fold together like layers of smoke. From the brief warnings of Scripture to the blackened earth of Carthage, from the bronze colossus imagined in medieval manuscripts to Milton's fiery general and Ginsberg's industrial curse, the shape of Moloch has shifted without end. Each age has tried to erase him, redefine him, or cage him in metaphor. And yet he endures. Not because he was a god of temples or a demon of grimoires, but because he names something that does not die. Hunger. Moloch is the hunger that consumes the future to preserve the present. In ancient valleys, that meant children placed into fire. In Milton's Councils of Hell, it meant armies marched into ruin. In modern skylines, it meant lives reduced to gears, souls devoured by efficiency. And in whispers of conspiracy, it becomes the suspicion that the powerful still demand sacrifices, only now hidden behind masks and policies. The forms change, but the rhythm is the same. Drums, fire, smoke. The logic that insists necessity requires betrayal. Mainstream history traces him as symbol and accusation, a figure whose presence often says more about those who condemned him than about who he really was. Scholars remind us, perhaps there was never a bronze idol in Hinnom. Perhaps Carthage's urns held cremations of grief. Perhaps the name was always a polemic rather than a biography. And yet, the uncertainty itself is revealing. If Moloch is not a deity, then he is an idea, a pattern of thought so terrible that even silence could not contain it. Fringe traditions declare him alive still, lurking in systems, in institutions, in rituals cloaked as entertainment. They speak of hidden sacrifices, of cultures shaped by forces too vast to see. Whether literal or symbolic, the claim circles back to the same insight. What we call Moloch is what we cannot bring ourselves to admit. That humans are willing to destroy what they most cherish if fear tells them it must be done. The observer lingers on the contrast that has haunted every chapter of this story. Love versus sacrifice. Protection versus betrayal. Creation versus fire. In the biblical vision, parents are commanded to shield their children, to guard the future as a sacred trust. Moloch inverts that command, demanding that protection itself be offered up as proof of devotion. This inversion is why his image lingers, why his name still tastes like ashes. It is not merely evil. It is evil that mocks what is most good. And so, the story closes not with resolution, but with recognition. Moloch has been idol, demon, metaphor, conspiracy, symbol. But beneath each mask is the same hunger. The fire has never gone out. It only moves, from valleys to battlefields, from furnaces to factories, from rituals to systems. Each age builds its own Tophet, sometimes in stone, sometimes in steel, sometimes in silence. Each age beats its own drums to drown out the cries. The observer breathes in the smoke and lets it settle. The lesson is not to fear a bronze idol forgotten in ruins, nor to obsess over secret rites. It is to recognize the logic whenever it whispers, "Give what you should protect. Trade away what you love. Burn the future for the present." That is Moloch's voice. And it speaks wherever people forget that devotion without mercy is no devotion at all. The valley is quiet now. No fire burns, no drums echo. But the ash remains, carried by the wind, settling into every generation's imagination. Moloch does not need to be summoned. He appears whenever we treat the irreplaceable as expendable, whenever power convinces us that cruelty is necessary. That is the real haunting. He is not a relic of the past, but a mirror of the present. The observer closes the vision softly, as though dimming a fire rather than extinguishing it. The flames retreat into memory, but their glow lingers, a reminder and a warning. Moloch, the ancient demon they tried to erase from history, still waits in the spaces where fear demands sacrifice. He is absence and presence, silence and drumbeat, always ready to evolve. And perhaps that is the final terror. He does not knock at the door. He builds the house around us. By the time we smell the smoke, the offering may already be gone.